you ever noticed how autobiographies or biographies will cover an entire person's life in 150 pages or 200 pages? I mean, how in the world can you cover an entire life in just 200 pages? Well, they leave out the ordinary. They leave out the mundane. It's the same thing with movies. We watch a movie, and sometimes a movie will cover a year or 2 years or 5 years, sometimes an entire lifetime, sometimes decades or centuries. How do they do that? Well, they leave out the mundane. They leave out the ordinary. And the Bible's actually no different. Let me just nerd out for a moment and give you some stats that are rather interesting. If you look through the Bible, you would actually find that there's huge spaces of time that are just left out. Abraham is taken outside of the tent one night and shown all these stars, and God says, Abraham, someday you're going to have descendants that number the stars in the sky. It would be like 25 years before his first son was born. You look at Joseph, and Joseph has this prophetic dream about him being a leader sometime and his brothers bowing down to him. But it was like 14 years before that became a reality. We actually see a little bit later in the story where Joseph's in prison, and there's like one little verse or two little verses about him in prison. But he was actually there, some say 2 years, some say maybe up to 10 years. And there's nothing said about it. You get to the end of the book of Genesis, and it ends, you flip over the page, and Exodus starts, and there's 400 years of history that's not even told. Think about all the people. Think about all the dreams. Think about all the stories that could be told, and there's nothing. David is brought in by Samuel, and he's anointed as the future king of Israel. And 15 years would pass, and most of those years, David's running for his life. A lot of those years, we're not actually told anything. Jesus of all people. We hear about his birth. We see a little bit about him at around 2 years old, and then boom, nothing's talked about him until he's 12 years old. Couple of verses when he's 12 years old, and boom, we don't hear anything until he's in his 30s. What happened to those 10 years between 2 and 12? What about those years between 12 and 30s? Everything that happened to him. They left out all this ordinary, boring, mundane parts of life. That's why I think sometimes we watch movies and read books and even read the Bible, and we go, why can't my life be more like that? Because they're hitting the high points and the low points, and they're leaving out all of the ordinary, which is what most of life is. It was with Jesus. Think about Jesus being here for, let's say, 35, 36 years on this earth, and we actually only hear about 4 years of his life. And at the end of the book of John, John actually says, I suppose if we wrote everything that we saw Jesus do and say, the whole world would be full of books. And he's talking about 4 years. What about the 30 other years that we hear virtually nothing? See, life is full of the ordinary, the boring, the mundane. Life is full of us brushing our teeth, doing dishes, doing laundry, getting dressed, sleeping. That's what life is. So let me give you just a little bit of encouragement, a few encouragements regarding the ordinary, mundane parts of life. Number one, you're not alone. It's how it is for all of us. Even Jesus spent most of his life on this earth not doing miracles and proclaiming himself as the Messiah, but working as a carpenter, going home, hugging his mom, going to funerals, in fact, burying his father, getting dressed, sleeping, working, getting dressed, sleeping, working. It's part of life. The second thing I want to encourage you with is don't waste that time. Those waiting periods that we see with people like Moses and Joseph and David, God did some of his greatest work in those times. David was crushed during his waiting period, and if you read the story, The crushing of David made him a king that was much different than his arrogant predecessor, Saul. And so God can do something special in those times of waiting. Don't waste those times of waiting. There's actually something happening when nothing happens. There's actually something happening when nothing happens. There's actually something happen when nothing happens. Don't waste those waiting times. Number 3, I think of Ephesians chapter 5, verse 16, where it says, make the most of every opportunity. It was life-changing for me when I began to understand that I could see God in the mundane, the ordinary as well. I could actually honor God in that. So I remember when I first started grasping the enormity of that truth, and I had to go mow my lawn, and well, I recognize we're in Phoenix now, so I have to explain to some of you what a lawn is. A lawn is a big chunk of land that has grass on it. In some parts of the country, they have those actually. And when we lived up in Montana in the summer, every week I'm out there mowing my lawn, and I remember when I realized God actually cared about that. Seriously, God cares about that? Yes. And God cares about you brushing your teeth, and God cares about you doing dishes, and God cares about you doing laundry, even those ordinary mundane things in life. And so sometimes before I would go start up my mower, I would say, God, I'm going to mow my lawn, and I pray I can just honor you and glorify you in the way that I mow this lawn. I don't know if you've seen the new series about the life of Jesus called The Chosen. There's a scene in there that I love. Jesus is it's before he's publicly proclaiming himself as the Messiah, and Jesus is out in the country and he's camping and he's making little toys out of wood. And there's a scene where he looks at one and he just pushes it away from him, and then he smiles at it. And I love that scene because that's how most of our life is. You know, when you change the oil in your car, when you do the dishes, when you put on your clothes in the morning, when you brush your teeth, when you mow your lawn, you can actually glorify God in that as well. Don't forget that there's actually something happening when nothing's happening.
Mundane.